This is an OSFP-XD. But what is it, and how is it different to an OSFP? If you want to find out more, stick around and we'll check it out. To understand what the OSFP-XD is, let's first talk about the OSFP. The initial hardware specification of the OSFP MSA form factor was published in March 2017, and it's got 8 electrical lanes, and that's also where the name comes from, because OSFP as in octal, or Latin octo, meaning 8. And depending on the generation, we've got 50, 100 or 200 gigabit per electrical lane. So the total data rates then result at 400 gig, 800 gig and 1.6 tera. Now what the OSFP-XD does is, instead of increasing the data rate per electrical lane, it actually increases the number of electrical lanes. To be more precise, it doubles it from 8 to 16, and that's also where the XD comes from, as in extra or extended density. And it's actually quite easy to see that we now have more electrical lanes if we have a look at the connector of the transceiver. Because here on the left-hand side we've got an OSFP-XD, here we have an OSFP, and that electrical connector, you will see, it is, number one, it's much longer, and obviously we now also have many more connection pins. So with these 16 electrical lanes, we then end up with a total data rate of 800 gig, 1.6 tera and also 3.2 terabit per second. But didn't we once have that whole concept of doubling the electrical lanes once before? Well, yes we did, because the QSFP-DD is actually the double density version of the QSFP. So in other words, 8 instead of 4 electrical lanes. And as a matter of fact, when the QSFP-DD was designed, it was specifically designed to be backward compatible with the QSFP. So in other words, if we have a look at the connector once again, then the inner part of the QSFP-DD connector is actually identical and pin compatible to that of the QSFP. So in other words, it is possible to plug in a QSFP into a QSFP-DD port. So in other words, you can actually operate your QSFP transceivers in a QSFP-DD port as long as the equipment supports it. So now the interesting question is that also the case for OSFP and OSFP-XD? And the very simple and straightforward answer is no. Because even if we have a look at them mechanically, it won't fit. So if I take these two transceivers, at the top I've got the OSFP, at the bottom I've got the OSFP-XD, and I make sure that they're here flush at the top, you'll actually then see that the OSFP-XD is actually a little bit thicker than the OSFP. So in other words, if I would try to plug in an OSFP into an OSFP-XD port, we wouldn't have proper support of that transceiver, and in addition to that, there are also additional mechanical barriers for you to preventing you plugging in an OSFP into an OSFP-XD port. So now obviously the question is that a bad thing that we don't have that backward compatibility anymore? And once again the answer is no. Because back then, when the QSFP-DD was designed and this whole idea of the backward compatibility was introduced, the idea then was to make an easier transition and migration from 100 gig to the higher data rate. So in other words, you could still use your 100 gig transceivers in the higher data rate equipment. But as it turns out, it wasn't that important, which is probably why, when designing the OSFP-XD, that added layer of complexity to maintain a backward compatibility was left aside. So, I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something today. If so, please leave a comment. And of course, remember to follow our channel so you get your regular dose of brain snack. Until next time, bye bye!